The North Sea does not warn you before it kills you. On an autumn morning in 865 AD, the waters off the eastern coast of England were the colour of hammered iron, grey, cold, indifferent. A thin mist clung to the surface like a funeral shroud draped over something enormous and still breathing. The fishermen of East Anglia who ventured out before dawn that morning heard it first. Not the crash of waves, not the cry of gulls, but something rhythmic and low and deeply wrong. A sound like the heartbeat of a creature too large to have any business existing. The slow, synchronized pull of thousands of oars moving through black water. Then the shapes appeared. Not one, not 10, not 50. Hundreds of dragon-headed longships materialized from the fog along the horizon, stretching north and south as far as any living eye could see. A fleet so vast it seemed less like an armada and more like the sea itself had grown a spine and decided to stand up. Like a great serpent slowly shedding the skin of one world to reveal another, the Viking fleet slid toward the English shore in absolute silence, broken only by those oars, those relentless mechanical oars, pulling the future forward, whether England was ready for it or not. The fishermen ran. They were right to run. But here is the thing that history books rarely pause long enough to tell you. The thing that makes this story not just remarkable, but genuinely, deeply strange. The man commanding that fleet, the architect of this invasion, the strategic mind who had spent months planning every detail of what was about to happen to 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, that man could not walk to the shore under his own power. He was carried. 4 warriors lifted him on a wooden shield as the first longships ground against the English sand, and they bore him forward like a king being presented to a conquered world that hadn't realized yet it was conquered. He was Ivar, called the Boneless, and he was about to break England. The paradox sits at the heart of this entire story, and it demands to be stated plainly before we go any further. The most devastating military commander in the 9th century Viking world, a man who would capture York, execute kings, establish a dynasty that would outlast most of the kingdoms he destroyed, and earn the title King of all Norsemen in Ireland and Britain, was a man whose own body had, from birth, worked against him. The sagas describe his condition in language so stark it reads almost like poetry. Only cartilage was where bone should have been. His legs were useless, or near useless. He could not march with his men. He could not charge into the shield wall. He could not do any of the things that Viking culture demanded of its warriors. And yet, what unfolded from that autumn morning in 865 was not a raid. Viking raids had struck the English coast for nearly a century by that point. Brutal, fast, catastrophic for the monasteries and coastal towns that absorbed them, but ultimately temporary. Hit and run. Take what you can carry and disappear before the locals organize. That was the old way. This was something else entirely. This was conquest. Systematic, patient, intellectually designed conquest. Within 4 years, Ivar and his brothers would shatter 3 of the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Within a decade, a third of England would be living under Viking law. The place names, the street layouts, the very genetic makeup of northern and eastern England would be permanently altered. Towns that exist today, Grimsby, Whitby, Scunthorpe, Thorpe, hundreds more, carry Norse roots because of what began on that grey morning when a man who could not walk was carried ashore to remake a nation. This is the story of how he did it. Not the legend, not the television version. The real, documented, scholarly debated, archaeologically excavated truth beneath the myth of the boneless Viking who crushed the mightiest kingdom on the map. And the truth is darker, stranger, and more fascinating than anything the sagas invented. To understand what Ivar the Boneless accomplished, you first have to understand what England was in 865 AD. Because England is actually the wrong word entirely. England did not exist. What occupied the island of Britain south of the Scottish kingdoms was a fractured, constantly warring collection of 7 distinct Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that historians call the Heptarchy. East Anglia in the east, Essex and Kent in the southeast, Sussex along the southern coast, Mercia sprawling through the Midlands, Wessex dominating the southwest, and Northumbria stretching across the entire north. 7 crowns, 7 armies, 7 sets of ambitions and grievances and dynastic complications. They did not like each other. They had been fighting each other in various configurations of alliance and betrayal for centuries. The kings of Mercia had spent decades attempting to dominate the other kingdoms, and had largely succeeded in the south, only to watch that dominance erode as Wessex grew stronger. Northumbria, the northernmost and in many ways the most strategically vulnerable of the 7 kingdoms, was in 865 actively consuming itself in civil war. King Osbert, who had ruled Northumbria for 18 years, had been deposed by a rival named Alla, a man whose claim to the throne was legally dubious, and whose grip on power was therefore entirely dependent on projecting military strength he may not have actually possessed. A kingdom divided against itself, a king whose throne rested on a foundation of sand, and a sea to the east that was filling that autumn with dragon ships. Now understand what was waiting on those ships. The sons of Ragnar Lothbrok had grown up in the long shadow of their father's legend. Ragnar himself is one of those historical figures who exists simultaneously in the documentary record and in mythology, and separating the two is a task that has defeated generations of scholars. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: there was a Viking leader of enormous prestige operating in the mid-9th century who raided extensively in England and Francia, and whose name and deeds became the foundation for a tradition of saga literature that would be written down in Iceland centuries after the events it describes. Whether the specific Ragnar of legend, the man who allegedly sailed up the Seine to sack Paris, who travelled to England and back, who fathered a dynasty of fearsome sons, was a single individual or a composite figure assembled from multiple historical warlords, his sons were real. Their exploits are documented not just in Norse sagas, but in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in Irish annals, in Frankish records. They existed, they fought, they conquered. And according to the tradition that shaped their identities, their father had been murdered. The story, and we must acknowledge it as story even while we take it seriously, because the line between history and legend in 9th century Scandinavia was not a line so much as a smear, goes like this. Ragnar Lothbrok, returning from a raid on Northumbria, was captured by King Ella, and Ella, rather than simply executing his prisoner or ransoming him back, chose a death designed for maximum theatrical cruelty. He threw Ragnar into a pit of venomous snakes and watched him die slowly, allegedly to the sound of Ragnar himself singing a death song as the venom worked through his body. News of this travelled back to Scandinavia. The response it provoked is worth examining carefully, because the differences in how each of Ragnar's sons received the news tells you almost everything about who they were and how they would fight. There are accounts, fragmentary, legendary, but consistent enough across multiple sources to suggest they preserve some kernel of genuine tradition, of the moment Ragnar's sons learned of their father's death. Halfdan, the most physically aggressive of the brothers, reportedly leaped to his feet and gripped his sword so hard his knuckles went white, demanding immediate war. Others wept. Others swore oaths of vengeance in the theatrical Norse tradition, invoking gods and ancestors and all the blood that would be required to balance the scales. Ivar sat still. He asked one question. Not, how do we avenge him? That was assumed. Not, when do we sail? That was obvious. Ivar asked, is Allah strong or weak right now? It was the question of a man who was already thinking past grief, past rage, past the emotional response that every other person in the room was drowning in. It was the question of a commander. And the answer, that Allah had just seized a throne he didn't fully control, from a king who still had loyalists, in a kingdom currently divided, was the answer that shaped everything that followed. Because Ivar did not plan a raid, he planned a campaign. To understand the dread that the Great Heathen Army inspired in England, you have to first confront what it actually was, and what it was had never been seen before on English soil. Previous Viking incursions had followed a consistent pattern for nearly 100 years. A fleet would appear, usually in summer, strike a monastery or coastal settlement with overwhelming violence, load the ships with silver and slaves and portable wealth, and vanish before any organized military response could arrive. It was catastrophic for the communities it struck, but strategically manageable for the kingdoms as a whole. The Vikings came like a storm. Storms pass. The Great Heathen Army did not pass. Contemporary English sources, desperately struggling to describe something that had no precedent in their experience, called it a Mysel here, a great army. But the word great fails to capture the thing. Estimates of its size range enormously across modern scholarship, but conservative assessments suggest something between 2,000 and 15,000 warriors. And, more importantly, these warriors arrived not in the lean, fast raiding ships of previous incursions, but in a fleet that included supply vessels, horses, and the logistical infrastructure of an army that intended to stay. They brought their war horses. They brought their craftsmen. Some accounts suggest they brought families. This was not a raid with an exit strategy. This was colonization, with a sword held at England's throat. The Anglo-Saxon monks who witnessed the army's movements wrote about it in the language of apocalypse. They described the Viking host as darkening the roads, filling the rivers, consuming the countryside the way a locust swarm consumes a wheat field, leaving behind not emptiness, but scorched earth and silence. One account compares the arrival of the Danes to a tide that washed in and simply refused to recede. These were men of God, writing for an audience of believers, and they reached instinctively for the imagery of divine punishment, because nothing in their political or military vocabulary was adequate to describe an army of this size, this organization, and this apparent permanence. And at its head, carried on a shield, seeing everything from above while the world moved around him, was Ivar. The sources we have for all of this require a moment of honest acknowledgement. because the story of Ivar the Boneless sits precisely at the fault line between documented history and elaborated legend. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle provides a contemporary English perspective, though it was written to serve the political interests of the West Saxon dynasty that eventually survived the Viking onslaught. The Norse sagas, the tale of Ragnar Lothbrok, the tale of Ragnar's sons, were committed to writing in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, 300 to 400 years after the events they describe, by writers working from oral traditions that had been reshaped by generations of telling. The Gesta Danorum of Saxo Grammaticus, a monumental Latin history of the Danes, adds further detail while conspicuously omitting the boneless epithet entirely. Irish annals, particularly the Annals of Ulster, provide independent corroboration of a Viking leader named Eamar operating in Britain and Ireland in exactly the years and places where Ivar the Boneless appears in the English sources. What this means is that we cannot be certain of everything. We can be certain that the Great Heathen Army invaded England in 865 under the leadership of men who included a figure named Ivar. We can be certain that this army captured York, killed 2 Northumbrian kings, subjugated Mercia, killed the King of East Anglia, and fundamentally altered the political geography of England. Beyond that, every specific detail, the blood eagle, the personal motivations, the physical disability, exists in a space where history and legend have been married long enough that their children cannot always tell you which parent they take after. But here is what the uncertainty itself tells you about Ivar the Boneless. 2 centuries after his death, people were still telling stories about him, not just in Scandinavia, in England, in Ireland, across the entire Viking world. That kind of lasting narrative power does not attach itself to ordinary men. The coast of East Anglia was not an accident. When modern students of military history first encounter the opening moves of Ivar's campaign, there is a temptation to ask the obvious question. If the Great Heathen Army came to avenge Ragnar's death at the hands of the Northumbrian king Alla, why did they land in East Anglia, the kingdom farthest from Northumbria, on the wrong end of the island? The answer to that question is the first and most important lesson in understanding how Ivar's mind worked. He did not think about today. He thought about 6 moves from now. East Anglia sat at the southeastern corner of England, bounded by the North Sea to the east, the Thames estuary to the south, and the open flatlands of Mercia to the west. Its coastline was accessible, its beaches gently sloped, and its fenland interior, a maze of marshes, waterways and low islands, was terrain that favoured a force comfortable with boats and water. More importantly, East Anglia was politically isolated from the other kingdoms, militarily modest, and, crucially, it possessed something the Viking army needed more than it needed gold: horses. The Great Heathen Army could not march from the coast of East Anglia to York on foot in any kind of tactical shape. The distance was too great, the terrain too varied, and the risk of being intercepted piecemeal by local forces too high. But on horseback, an army of several thousand could cover the same ground in a fraction of the time, arrive at its objective without having burned through its fighting strength on the march, and retain the mobility needed to respond to changing conditions. Ivar needed the horses of East Anglia before he needed the blood of Northumbria. He took them without a significant fight. The King of East Anglia at the time, facing a fleet of hundreds of longships on his doorstep, made the rational calculation that resistance was suicidal. He opened negotiations. Ivar accepted, with the same patience that characterized every aspect of his command. The army would winter in East Anglia. The locals would provide food and horses and would not be slaughtered in their beds. It was a transaction, brutal in its clarity, but functional for both parties. And while his army rested and the horses grew accustomed to their new riders, and the English countryside froze under its autumn frost, Ivar studied his maps and planned his march north. The route to York ran up through the heart of England, and every section of it posed different tactical problems. The kingdom of Mercia sat between East Anglia and Northumbria like a wall, but a wall with doors, if you knew where to look. The Roman roads that crisscrossed the Midlands provided the fastest overland routes, but they also meant predictability, and predictability meant ambush. The rivers, the Humber in the north, the Trent cutting through Mercia, were both obstacles and highways, depending on which way you chose to use them. Ivar would use them as highways. The fleet that had brought his army to England was not simply parked in East Anglian harbours waiting to go home. It was a mobile logistics train, following the army's progress along the coast and up the navigable rivers, keeping the warriors supplied and providing an evacuation route that most Anglo-Saxon commanders would never have thought to account for. York itself, the city that would become the great prize of the entire campaign, was an ancient Roman foundation built on a gravel ridge at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss. Its Roman walls, though centuries old and in varying states of repair, still provided formidable defensive infrastructure. The city was the political and ecclesiastical capital of Northumbria, home to the Archbishop of York and to whatever royal administration existed in a kingdom currently tearing itself apart over who had the right to sit on its throne. Taking York would not just be a military victory. It would be a symbolic decapitation of Northumbrian power, a seizure of the city that meant Northumbria in the same way that Mecca means Islam or Rome meant Christendom. Ivar understood this. He planned accordingly. The force composition of the Great Heathen Army reflected the full range of Viking military capability as it existed in the mid-9th century. The backbone of the army was its infantry, heavily equipped warriors carrying the large, round, iron-bossed wooden shields that could interlock to form the shield wall that Viking armies deployed with devastating effect. Individual warriors carried weapons suited to their wealth and preference. The broad-bladed axe was the iconic Viking weapon. But swords, expensive, prestigious, and brutally effective, were common among the higher status fighters. Spears were universal, useful both for throwing and for the pushing and stabbing that characterized close-order shield wall combat. Bows were present in smaller numbers, generally considered a secondary weapon in the Norse tradition, though there is specific evidence that Ivar himself favoured the bow, a weapon he could use effectively from a fixed position, which, given his physical limitations, may have been not just preference, but necessity. The newly acquired East Anglian horses transformed the army's tactical profile. Viking cavalry were not the armoured knights that would dominate medieval European warfare in later centuries. They were infantry who rode to battle and then dismounted to fight, using their horses for strategic mobility rather than tactical shock. But this still represented an enormous advantage over an Anglo-Saxon force that could not match their pace. Ivar could now choose when and where to fight, with a freedom of movement that no English king could easily counter. Against this force, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms could, theoretically, field substantial armies of their own, but they suffered from structural problems that Ivar's strategic approach was specifically designed to exploit. The English military system relied on the fyrd, a levy of free men obligated to serve when called, supplemented by the professional household warriors, the housecarls, who formed the fighting core of any royal army. The fyrd could be large, but was slow to assemble, limited in how long it could serve in the field, and deeply reluctant to fight outside its home kingdom. This last point was critical. English kings could not easily call on each other for rapid mutual support, because the political relationships between the kingdoms were too tangled, and the logistical challenges of moving armies across unfamiliar territory too significant. Ivar was counting on this. He was counting on fighting each kingdom separately before they could organize a unified response. The night before the army moved north toward Northumbria, the camp at York's approach road was quiet in the particular way that large assemblies of men become quiet the night before violence. Not silent, but strangely hushed, as if the usual noise of thousands of human beings had been dampened by the collective weight of what the morning would bring. Fires burned in long rows across the floodplain, each one surrounded by the shapes of men sharpening weapons, eating their evening meal, talking in the low voices that men use when they're thinking about mortality. A young warrior from the Danish coast, no name survives, no face, just the archetype of every young man who has ever marched toward a walled city he has never seen, sat with a wet stone and worked it methodically along the edge of his axe. The rhythm of it was almost meditative. The blade caught the firelight and threw it back in brief orange flashes. He was thinking about a farm, about a woman's face, about whether the fortune-tellers who said this campaign would make him rich were telling the truth or selling comfort to men who needed it. In a larger tent, set apart from the main camp, Ivar lay on a pallet of furs with a piece of linen spread across his chest. Not sleeping, never quite sleeping before a major engagement, and traced the outline of the city with one finger. He had been describing York to himself from captured merchants and English informants for months. He knew the approximate length of its walls. He knew where the Roman stonework was strongest and where centuries of neglect had left gaps. He knew that Alla and Osbert, the two rival kings who now needed each other to survive, had not had nearly enough time to fully reconcile their armies into a single functioning force. He knew that the city's civilian population would panic when the army appeared, and that panic inside walls was as destructive as siege engines outside them. He did not know how many men he would lose tomorrow. He never let himself think too specifically about that particular number. What he knew was that if his calculations were correct, and they had been correct every time so far, York would be his before the leaves finished falling. On the other side of those walls, Alla of Northumbria was also awake. The accounts that survive do not tell us what he thought about, but we can infer something from what he did in the days that followed. He did not negotiate, did not attempt to buy the Vikings off with silver and promises the way that other English kings had done before him. Whether this was courage or arrogance, or simply the inflexibility of a man who had seized his throne by force and could not now be seen to yield it by negotiation, Alla chose to fight. It was the choice that Ivar had been expecting him to make. It was, in the end, the choice that killed him. Before the army slept, the Norse warriors performed their pre-battle rituals. The details vary across the sources and across the regions from which these men had come, but the broad patterns are consistent enough across saga literature and archaeological evidence to describe with reasonable confidence. Weapons were dedicated to Odin, the All-Father, the god of war and death and wisdom, who demanded payment in blood and received it willingly from those who fought in his name. Warriors swore oaths on the pommels of their swords or on the carved wooden images of gods that travelled with the army. Some men, the ones who would form the shock troops of the assault, were working themselves toward the berserker state, the controlled rage that stripped away fear and pain and left behind something purer and more terrible. Whether this state was achieved through fasting, through certain plants with psychoactive properties, through deliberate psychological conditioning, or through some combination of all three, remains debated by modern scholarship. What is not debated is that these warriors existed and that they were effective, blindly, terrifyingly, efficiently effective in the initial moments of contact, when their apparent inability to feel wounds or register pain broke the morale of defending forces before the fight had fairly begun. The priests of Northumbria, on the other side of York's walls, were praying to their own god, lighting candles, reading psalms, asking for intercession against what every literate Englishman in 866 AD had already learned to call, simply, the Danes. Two belief systems, two ways of making peace with the possibility of death, and in the space between them, a walled Roman city that would change hands before the week was out. Before we reach that morning, before the shields come up and the war cries begin, there is one more story that belongs in the preparation, because it tells you more about Ivar's character than any battle could. It is the story of the ox hide, and it is the story of how Ivar the Boneless took his first piece of England without drawing a single sword. When the Great Heathen Army first arrived in England, Ivar approached the established powers not always with immediate violence, but sometimes with negotiation, a tactical move that his brothers, more straightforwardly aggressive, frequently found baffling. In one account, when dealing with Allah directly, Ivar claimed he wanted only peace and asked only for as much land as could be covered by the largest ox hide he could find. Allah, reading this as the plea of a man who knew he was outmatched, agreed. He was imagining a patch of ground perhaps large enough for a small camp. He was imagining he had just solved a problem cheaply. Ivar took the hide and had it cut, not into large pieces, into thin strips barely wider than a finger, sliced with patient precision until the single hide had become an enormous, continuous strand of leather, hundreds of feet long. He then laid this strand in a great circle around the site he had chosen, which, in some versions of the account, enclosed enough ground for an entire fortress. He had not violated the agreement. He had simply understood it differently than Allah had intended. He had looked at a limitation and found inside it a geometry that nobody else had seen. It is the most perfect single image of how Ivar thought. Not the blood eagle, not the battle cry. This. A man carefully cutting a piece of leather into something it wasn't supposed to be, smiling at the shape of the thing he was making, utterly certain that his enemy's failure of imagination was the same as his enemy's defeat. The first thing you hear when a Viking fleet makes landfall on a sand beach is not what you expect. You expect screaming. You expect the clash of iron. You expect the catastrophic percussion of two forces colliding. But the East Anglian shore in the early morning of that autumn did not erupt with violence. What it erupted with was sound. The grinding crunch of hundreds of wooden hulls dragging across sand, the rhythmic shout of men hauling ropes, the wet slap of water against strakes, the high-pitched protest of timber under enormous strain, and beneath all of it, the low, constant sound of the wind off the North Sea, carrying salt and cold and the smell of something coming. The light was grey. The fog had not entirely lifted, and from the tree line behind the beach, the East Anglian lookouts who had spent the night watching the sea counted dragon heads and stopped counting somewhere around 40 because the number had become meaningless. They were watching a city arrive on the water. Ivar came ashore third, after the forward warriors had established a perimeter and after the scouts had reported no immediate military force assembling inland. 4 men carried him on the wide, flat shield that served as his mobile platform. Not a throne, not a litter, not any of the accommodations of weakness. A shield. The same piece of equipment every other warrior in the army used to keep himself alive. There was something about this that the men who served under him noted and remembered. Ivar did not pretend the shield was something other than what it was. He did not dress his limitation in euphemism. He rode the shield the way a commander rides a horse, as a tool that gave him an advantage, specifically the advantage of height and stability, and the ability to see the field. He looked at England. England, to all appearances, did not look back. The shore was empty of organized resistance. The fishing boats were gone, pulled up or fled. The nearest settlement's smoke had stopped rising. They doused their fires and were hiding. Smart. The instinct of people who had heard the stories. But the absence of immediate opposition was precisely what Ivar had been counting on. He had not come to East Anglia to fight its people. He had come to use them. By noon, on that first day, the army had established a beach camp of considerable size, and Ivar had sent messengers inland toward the court of the East Anglian king, with a message that was not quite a demand and not quite a request. It was more like an invoice. The Great Heathen Army would winter here. The king of East Anglia would provide horses, good horses, war horses, as many as the army required, and food sufficient to sustain several thousand men through the cold months. In return, the army would not burn. It would not kill. It would simply be present, in the way that a landslide is present, enormous, immovable, existing according to its own physics without particular reference to what was there before it arrived. The East Anglian king, some sources name him as Edmund, though the timing is disputed, and the martyrdom of Edmund definitively comes later in the story, sent his answer within 2 days. He would comply. This moment deserves more attention than it typically receives, because it is the moment that separated Ivar's campaign from every previous Viking incursion in English history. He had just secured the logistical foundation of a conquest. Horses for mobility, food for sustenance, a secure base of operations, without losing a single man. His army arrived at full strength. Their weapons were intact. Their morale was high, bolstered by the sense that they were travelling with a commander who knew exactly what he was doing. And all it had cost was the implied threat of what would happen if the answer had been no. But the horses were more than logistics. They were strategy. Because Ivar knew, and Alla did not yet know, that the army camped in East Anglia was not the same army that would appear before the walls of York. That army would be mobile in a way no Viking force in England had previously achieved. That army could cover 50 miles in a day if it had to. That army could be at York before Northumbria had finished debating whether to believe the reports coming from the south. The winter passed. By the time the army began its march north in the spring of 866, it had transformed. The men were rested. The horses were broken to their riders. The supply chain that would follow the army north, ships moving along the coast, smaller boats navigating inland waterways, was organized and functional. And Ivar, who had spent the winter doing exactly what he always did when other men were sleeping, had refined his understanding of Northumbria's political situation to the point where he knew not just how to attack the kingdom, but how to manage it after the attack. That distinction between knowing how to break something and knowing what to do with the pieces was what made him different from every other Viking commander of his generation. The march north was not a charge. It was a controlled, methodical advance. Units moved in order, with scouts ranging ahead and flanking parties preventing surprises from the local fyrd. The army crossed the Humber estuary and entered Northumbrian territory without significant opposition, which itself was significant. It meant that Alla and Osbert, still working through the raw mechanics of their uneasy reconciliation, had not positioned forces to defend the natural barrier that the Humber represented. Another failure of imagination. Another geometric advantage that Ivar stepped through. York appeared on the horizon in late autumn of 866. The Roman walls of York were old. That was both their greatest strength and, as Ivar immediately recognized, their greatest weakness. The original Roman fortifications had been built to a standard of engineering that the 9th century could not easily match. Massive stone courses, towers at regular intervals, gates reinforced with both masonry and timber. But Roman York had been built 4 centuries earlier, and 4 centuries without a professional maintenance corps had left the fortifications uneven. Some sections were in good repair, maintained by the Northumbrian kings for obvious reasons. Others had been allowed to deteriorate, stone robbed out for other construction projects, mortar crumbled, sections that had never been rebuilt after earlier damage. Ivar's informants had given him a rough map of where the weak points were. His engineers, because the Great Heathen Army included men whose expertise was exactly this kind of problem, had confirmed the assessment. But Ivar did not announce his intentions by immediately assaulting the walls. He surrounded the city first. The army spread out in a great arc around York, cutting the roads that led in and out, establishing positions that prevented resupply or reinforcement. The citizens of York, looking out from their walls at the host arrayed across the autumn countryside, would have seen campfires stretching from horizon to horizon. They would have smelled the smoke. They would have counted the lights and understood, in the wordless way that besieged people always understand, that the world outside had been replaced by something that intended their absolute submission. Inside the city, Alla and Osbert were doing what rival kings do when they suddenly need each other, arguing about strategy while pretending to agree. Each man's advisers whispering that their king should not yield the tactical initiative to the other. The result was paralysis. And paralysis, when your enemy is patient, is the same as defeat. Ivar was patient. He waited. He let the city's food supply begin to diminish. He let the fear inside the walls do its quiet work. And when his engineers had completed their survey of the weakest section of the Roman fortification, on the northeastern face, where a section of the stone course had subsided and the timber reinforcing the interior of the wall had partially rotted, he gave the order for the assault. What followed was not the romantic clash of heroes that the sagas preferred to describe. It was engineering. Viking warriors with improvised tools worked at the base of the weakest wall section, undermining the foundation, while other warriors maintained a steady barrage of arrows and thrown stones against the defenders on the parapet above, keeping their heads down, preventing them from leaning out to pour boiling water or drop stones on the men working below. The noise was enormous, screaming on both sides, the heavy thud of missiles against stone, the creak and groan of timber under stress. Ivar, positioned at the rear on his shield, watched the section of wall and waited for the sound he knew was coming. It came before most of the defenders realized what was happening. The wall did not fall so much as it leaned, and then pivoted, and then came down in a cascade of stone and dust and timber that opened a gap 20 feet wide in the Roman defences of York. Through that gap, like water finding the path of least resistance, the Viking warriors poured. The city fell in hours. The defenders inside, fighting in the narrow streets where their numbers could not spread out and their formation advantage evaporated, were overwhelmed by warriors who were not confused by urban terrain, who had been told exactly where to go and what to secure, who moved through the chaos of York's falling with the purposeful efficiency of men who had been briefed by a commander who had thought about this moment longer than they had. Both Alla and Osbert escaped the initial capture, but their armies did not escape intact, and the political authority of Northumbria, in the moment that York fell, ceased to exist as a functioning reality. Jorvik, that is what the Vikings called it. The name York comes, through centuries of linguistic evolution, from that Viking renaming. The city's identity was changed in an afternoon. The army did not stop. It never stopped. That was the thing about Ivar's campaign that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms could not psychologically process. There was no pause for celebration, no period of consolidation that gave the enemy time to recover. The machine kept moving. The winter of 866 to 867 passed inside York's captured walls with a tension that the sources describe but do not fully explain. Alla and Osbert, both still alive, both still commanding enough loyalists to constitute a meaningful military force, were doing something that the situation would not normally have permitted. They were talking to each other, reconciling, finding in the shared catastrophe of York's fall a common cause that their years of mutual hostility had never managed to create. It is one of history's bitterest ironies that it sometimes takes a great enough external threat to force enemies into the cooperation they should have maintained all along. But cooperation achieved out of desperation lacks the smooth functioning of cooperation built on trust and time. And when Alla and Osbert finally marched their combined force against York in March of 867, what they were sending was a coalition, not an army. There is a quality that experienced commanders develop, a sense of when the enemy is about to do something. And everything in Ivar's positioning in the weeks before March suggests he sensed the counterattack coming. The Great Heathen Army inside York was not resting. It was preparing. The gaps in the wall that had allowed the initial assault had been repaired and reinforced. But more importantly, Ivar had made a calculation about the nature of the battle that was coming, and he had arranged his forces accordingly. The calculation was this: Alla and Osbert would attack the gates, because that was what you did when you were trying to retake a walled city. They would concentrate their forces at the principal entry points and attempt to force their way through. A direct assault on the walls of their own capital city was psychologically appealing to both of them. It was their city, their fortress, their kingdom being reclaimed. They would come straight at the doors. But Ivar had left some of the doors open, not unlocked, not unguarded. Open just enough, with just enough apparent weakness visible to the scouts that Alla and Osbert would certainly have sent forward, to suggest that the defenders were spread thin, and that a concentrated assault on the main gate might actually succeed. It was the ox-hide trick at military scale. He had created a geometry inside the city that looked from outside like an opportunity, and that was in reality a trap. The morning of the Northumbrian assault on York in March 867 began before dawn, the way serious attacks always begin, in the cold and the dark, when the body's defences are lowest and the mind's ability to process chaos is most impaired. Allah led the assault on the main gate. Osbert simultaneously attacked the secondary entrance to the northeast. Their forces advanced across open ground outside the walls under a barrage of Norse arrows, men going down, others closing ranks over the fallen, shields raised against the rain of missiles, the collective noise of thousands of men moving toward death, rising and rising, until it became something that was no longer quite sound, but a physical pressure against the chest. The gates held, briefly. Then they were forced, and then the Northumbrian warriors flooded into York. They poured through the gates with the momentum of men who had been told they were retaking their capital, who had lost months of humiliation to avenge, who could see the interior of their own city opening up before them, and felt the first surge of what felt like victory. They spread out into the streets, where the architecture of the Roman city channeled them into narrow lanes that ran between buildings. They were inside. They were winning. The moment stretched, golden, like the first second after you've been told something wonderful. But the doors behind them were closing. Viking warriors, positioned in buildings and alleyways and on rooftops throughout the city, waiting, silent, for precisely this moment, emerged all at once. The Northumbrians who had entered York were now inside a city they thought they knew, but which had been restructured around them into a killing floor. The narrow streets that had seemed like pathways to victory were death corridors. The buildings that lined them were full of men with axes and spears. The very walls of York, which Allah had meant to reclaim, were now working against him, because walls that hold your enemies out also hold your warriors in. And Ivar had arranged things so that the holding was catastrophically asymmetric. The battle inside York in March 867 was not a single engagement. It was dozens of simultaneous engagements in every alley and courtyard and doorway of a Roman city. There was no line. There was no formation. There was only the violence of proximity. Men fighting with weapons at ranges where technique mattered less than commitment, where the determining factor was not training or tactics, but the willingness to continue when everything in your body was screaming at you to stop. By mid-morning, the outcome was no longer in doubt. By early afternoon, it was over in the way that routs are over. Not cleanly, with a moment of decision and a clear aftermath, but messily, with groups of men still fighting in corners of the city while others were already running and others were already dead. Osbert died in the fighting, cut down in a street somewhere in the interior of York, his body identified later by the quality of his armour and the seal ring on his finger. Allah was captured. The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened all day. They brought Allah to Ivar, not dragged, walked, with guards on either side, hands bound behind him, the formal posture of a captured king being brought before the man who had captured him. He still had his crown. Nobody had removed it. This was deliberate. Ivar had given specific instructions. The crown stays on. He wanted to look at a king when he delivered his judgment. The accounts of what followed exist in multiple versions across multiple sources and represent one of the most contested moments in Viking history. The blood eagle. The execution ritual in which the victim's ribcage was opened from behind, the ribs severed from the spine, and the lungs drawn out through the wounds to spread like wings. The sagas describe it in graphic detail. The Anglo-Saxon sources, the sources closest in time to the actual event, describe Allah's death in less specific terms, confirming that he was killed by the Danes, but not elaborating on the method. Modern scholars are divided. Some accept the blood eagle as historically genuine, a real execution ritual used in extreme cases of vengeance. Others argue that it is a literary invention, a piece of retributive mythology invented or elaborated by saga writers who needed Allah's death to be appropriately spectacular. The truth, as it almost always does when we are dealing with the 9th century, refuses to resolve into certainty. What we can say with confidence is this: Allah died. He died at Viking hands. He died as an act of deliberate judgment rather than battlefield accident. And whatever the precise method, his death was understood by everyone who heard of it, and the news spread across England rapidly, carried by traders and refugees and the Anglo-Saxon communication networks that worked even when armies were in the field. As a message. Not just a killing, a statement. The sons of Ragnar Lothbrok had come for a specific man, had pursued him with extraordinary patience and planning across an entire military campaign, and had executed him in a manner that was meant to be remembered. The silence in the room when it was done. It was the kind of silence that happens after something has shifted in the world. Not the silence of mourning, not the silence of shock, but the silence of recalibration, where everyone in the space is quietly updating their understanding of what is possible and what can now happen next. Ivar did not speak. His face, according to the tradition that preserves these moments, even when it distorts their specifics, showed nothing that could be clearly named as satisfaction. He looked at what had been done. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he gave the order to install Egbert, a Northumbrian nobleman of Anglo-Saxon blood who had made his peace with the reality of Viking power, as the new king of Northumbria. A puppet, a face on a throne that Ivar now effectively owned. The strategy behind this was as cold as everything else Ivar did. A completely destroyed Northumbria was useless. No tax base, constant rebellion, a permanent drain on Viking military resources that could be better deployed elsewhere. A Northumbria that still had a nominally Anglo-Saxon king, that still ran its own administrative apparatus, that still collected its own taxes and kept its own order, but that paid tribute to Viking authority and provided no military threat. That was enormously valuable. That was an asset rather than a liability. Ivar had not come to England to burn it down. He had come to own it. The machine kept moving, south from York, into Mercia. The army moved with the efficiency of an organisation that had been doing this long enough to stop thinking about the individual steps and simply execute them. Ivar had a target: Nottingham, the strategic settlement that sat astride the main routes connecting northern and southern England, the place that controlled the geography of the Midlands the way a keystone controls an arch. Take Nottingham and Mercia was split. Hold Nottingham, and the south could not easily reinforce the north, or vice versa. He took Nottingham without a major engagement. The Mercian king, Burgred, confronted with a force whose capabilities he had been hearing about in increasingly alarming terms since York fell the previous year, did what a sensible king does when he cannot win alone. He asked for help. Specifically, he asked his southwestern neighbour, the Kingdom of Wessex, to send forces. The West Saxon king Ethelred responded, and with him came his younger brother, a man who would eventually become the most famous Anglo-Saxon in history. The future Alfred the Great, in the autumn of 867, was an 18-year-old prince helping to besiege Nottingham. They could not take it back. This is the moment where Ivar's patience demonstrated its full strategic value. He was inside Nottingham's walls, with a well-supplied, well-rested force that had no particular reason to come out and fight on terms that the besiegers had chosen. The Anglo-Saxon coalition outside the walls was large, perhaps the largest English force assembled in years, but large coalitions have large needs, and needs that the countryside around Nottingham could not indefinitely supply. Ivar waited. He let the alliance fray at the edges as men worried about their farms and their families and the approaching cold. He let the Mercian and West Saxon commanders disagree about strategy in the way that Allied commanders always disagree when there is no obvious path to victory and the pressure of failure is building. The siege collapsed. A truce was negotiated. The Danes would withdraw to York. Burgred of Mercia would not be punished. The status quo would be formally acknowledged, which meant that the status quo, Viking control of Northumbria, Viking presence in Mercia, Viking capability to move at will through the Midlands, was formally acknowledged. Ivar had taken Nottingham through patience and given it back through diplomacy, and emerged from the transaction with everything he actually needed: time, a strengthened position in the north, and the demonstrated inability of the southern English kingdoms to cooperate effectively enough to push him out. But he was not done with East Anglia. In 869, the Great Heathen Army, with Ivar still at its head alongside his brother Ubba, returned to the kingdom that had given them horses and winter quarters 4 years earlier. The terms of that earlier arrangement had apparently been provisional. Or perhaps Ivar had always known he would be back. Either way, the East Anglian kingdom, which had submitted peacefully in 865, was now going to be asked to submit permanently. King Edmund of East Anglia refused. Not the military submission. He was a realistic man in an impossible position, and he understood that his army could not defeat the force now arrayed against him in the field. What he refused was the theological demand that accompanied the military one. Ivar's ultimatum that Edmund renounce his Christian faith and rule as a vassal of Viking power, acknowledged as subordinate to pagan authority. Edmund was a devout man. His Christianity was not incidental to his identity as a king, it was inseparable from it. To renounce Christ would have been, in his understanding of the world, to cease to be the kind of king God had appointed him to be. He chose death over apostasy. The execution of Edmund of East Anglia, bound to a tree, beaten, shot with arrows until his body resembled a hedgehog's back, as a later account puts it, then beheaded, was not, in Ivar's calculation, an act of pure cruelty. It was a statement. The same kind of statement that Allah's death had been. It announced to every English king watching from the sidelines that the choice was not between yielding territory and keeping faith. The choice was between yielding everything, including faith, or dying in the specific and demonstrable way that comes from refusing Vikings who have run out of patience. Edmund became a saint. The town built around his burial place became Bury St. Edmunds, which exists still. His feast day is November 20th. He is the patron saint of Suffolk. The man whose death was meant to terrorize his contemporaries into submission became, instead, a permanent emblem of resistance, which is, perhaps, the deepest irony that Ivar's entire campaign produced. By the end of 869, 3 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been shattered or subjugated. Ivar had not lost a single major engagement. His casualty count, relative to the territory and political control he had acquired, was astonishingly low. The army that had landed in East Anglia 4 years earlier was still largely intact, still cohesive, still under the command of a man who had not yet made a strategic mistake significant enough to cost him the initiative. He looked west toward Ireland. He saw more. The battlefield of York, 3 days after the March engagement, was quiet in the way that only recently violent places are quiet. A silence that carries weight, that has texture, that presses against the inside of the chest when you stand in it. The bodies had been mostly cleared. Mostly. The detritus of battle remained. Broken shields, shafts of spears snapped off at the point of impact. The occasional piece of personal kit dropped by a running man who had decided survival was worth more than his equipment. The walls of York, where they had been breached and then repaired and then fought over, showed the evidence in fresh stone and dark staining. The narrow streets of the city still smelled of iron and smoke, and the particular biological aftermath of several thousand men having fought in an enclosed space on a cold morning. The casualty numbers from the York campaign, across its full arc from initial assault to the March engagement, cannot be stated with any precision that scholarship would accept without heavy qualification. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the deaths of both Northumbrian kings and describes the defeat of their forces in terms that suggest catastrophic loss, but gives no figures. The Norse sources are even less interested in arithmetic. They measure victory in qualitative terms, in the fame of the fallen, in the magnitude of what was taken, not in the body counts that modern military history has trained us to reach for. Conservative estimates from modern historians, working backward from what can be inferred about force sizes and the nature of urban combat in the period, suggest Northumbrian losses in the thousands across the full campaign. Viking losses, reflecting their tactical advantage, were substantially lower, but were still significant enough that the army required the resupply and rest that it took during its period of consolidation at York before moving south. Alla of Northumbria, dead, killed in the aftermath of the March engagement, his manner of dying disputed by history and mythology in equal measure. Osbert of Northumbria, dead, killed in the street fighting inside York, identified by his ring. Egbert of Northumbria, alive, installed as Ivar's client king, governing a truncated Northumbria under Viking authority. He would reign until 872, when he was driven out by his own people, a fact that suggests Ivar's puppet had not managed to make himself beloved, which was probably not a surprise to anyone, including Ivar. Edmund of East Anglia, dead in 869, martyred, beatified, canonized. His cult would grow throughout the medieval period into one of the most significant in England. The abbey built at his burial place became a major pilgrimage destination. The city that grew around it, Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, still bears his name. Alfred of Wessex, alive, 18 years old, watching from the south, learning from everything he had just seen. He would become the one English king of his generation who could not be beaten by the Viking machine. But that is a different story, and it is not Ivar's story. York, in the months after its capture, underwent a transformation that modern archaeology has been remarkably good at documenting. The Viking occupation of the city left material traces at every level of the site. Specific styles of metalwork, specific patterns of craft production, specific architectural modifications that distinguish the Norse phase of the city's occupation from what came before and after. Jorvik, the Viking city that grew on the foundation of Roman Iberacum and Anglo-Saxon York, became one of the most important urban centres in the Viking world. Not London, not Dublin, though Dublin would come. Jorvik, a city on the Ouse in the north of England, rebuilt by the people who had just destroyed it, refashioned into something that was neither Romano-British nor Anglo-Saxon, but unmistakably Norse. The streets were laid differently. The crafts were different. The smells were different. Tanneries and textile workshops and smithies operating at a density that reflects an urban population larger and more economically complex than the city had supported before the conquest. Archaeologists excavating the Coppergate site in York in the 1970s and 1980s found layers of Viking-era material of extraordinary richness. Organic materials preserved by the waterlogged conditions of the site that would normally have rotted away, giving researchers an almost uniquely detailed picture of daily life in a Viking city. Shoes, combs, textiles, tools. The physical residue of a civilization that had transplanted itself from Scandinavia to the north of England, and had begun, immediately and with characteristic practical efficiency, to make itself at home. But Ivar did not stay to watch the city he had made. In 870 he moved, not south, not deeper into England, but northwest, and then west, across the Irish Sea, back to a theatre of operations that he had been working in before the English campaign began. He rejoined his old companion Olaf the White, the Viking king of Dublin, and together they turned their combined forces against a target that had nothing to do with the English kingdoms. Dumbarton Rock, the fortress capital of the ancient Brittonic kingdom of Strathclyde, which sat at the confluence of the Clyde and the Leven in what is now western Scotland. The siege of Dumbarton lasted 4 months. 4 months is a long time. 4 months of watching walls, of cutting supply lines, of waiting for thirst and hunger and the slow erosion of hope to do what direct assault could not accomplish on the first day. But Ivar had demonstrated repeatedly that patience was not a strain for him. He could wait. He had always been able to wait better than the people he was fighting. Dumbarton fell in 870. The kingdom of Strathclyde, one of the last surviving Brittonic kingdoms of northern Britain, was shattered. Ivar and Olaf returned to Dublin in 871 with, as the Irish annals record, a vast quantity of spoils and an enormous number of prisoners, the enslaved captives of Dumbarton, men and women and children who would be processed through the Viking slave trade to destinations across the known world. The entry in the Annals of Ulster for that year records something extraordinary. It calls Ivar, Imar in the Irish rendering of the name, King of the Northmen of all Ireland and Britain. The man who had been carried ashore in East Anglia 6 years earlier was now acknowledged by the most meticulous record keepers of his era as the dominant power across 2 islands. Ivar the Boneless died in 873. The Annals of Ulster record it simply, a sudden and terrible illness. No battle, no execution, no heroic last stand that the sagas could have used. Just illness, and then death, in Dublin, in the city he had helped make into the dominant Viking settlement in Ireland. He was somewhere between his mid-30s and his mid-40s, depending on which birth date you accept. He had spent roughly the last decade of his life reshaping the political geography of 2 islands, and founding a dynasty that would continue to exercise power over significant portions of Britain and Ireland for generations after his death. The immediate territorial consequences of his campaigns were enormous and lasting. The Danelaw, the region of northern and eastern England in which Viking law and custom supplanted Anglo-Saxon administration, took the shape that Ivar's campaigns had given it and retained that shape even after the political fortunes of specific Viking rulers rose and fell. The line between Danelaw and English England was not a rigid border so much as a cultural gradient, but it was real, and its effects were permanent. The English language absorbed thousands of Norse words during the Danelaw period, words for everyday things, for farming and fishing and law and navigation, that survive in standard English today without most speakers having any idea where they came from. Sky, window, knife, husband, egg, law. These are Norse words, embedded in the English language as permanent artifacts of the Viking occupation that Ivar initiated. The dynasty he founded, known in scholarship as the Ymir, the descendants of Ymar, held power in Dublin and Waterford for generations, producing the leaders of the Viking settlements on both sides of the Irish Sea through the 9th and well into the 10th century. Reginald of Waterford, the first king of that city. The successive kings of Viking Dublin. The rulers who maintained Norse power in the Irish Sea region long after Ivar himself was gone. All of them descended from, or claimed descent from, the man carried on the shield. The story of what happened to his body belongs in the category of legend that we cannot verify and cannot entirely dismiss, because the legend itself is historically revealing. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok records that Ivar gave specific instructions about his burial. He wanted to be interred in a place exposed to enemy attack, at a location where future invaders would be likely to land. He believed, or the tradition says he believed, that his body, buried in such a place, would serve as a curse on anyone who came against the land. Enemies who attempted to invade through his burial site would be met with supernatural misfortune. The saga then records, and this is the part that is either fascinating history or elaborate mythology, take your position depending on your priors, that this prophecy held true for 2 centuries. Viking rulers of northern England and Ireland who crossed the waters Ivar had controlled were successful. Their enemies were not. And then, in 1066, William the Conqueror arrived in England. Before he could complete his conquest, the saga claims, he went to Ivar's burial mound, opened it, found the body miraculously undecayed, and had it burned. Only after this was done did William's invasion succeed. In 1686, a farm labourer named Thomas Walker, digging in the churchyard of St Wiston's Church in Repton, Derbyshire, broke through into a burial mound. Inside he found, according to contemporary accounts, a human skeleton of extraordinary size. Later archaeological excavations at Repton in the 1970s and 1980s, led by Professor Martin Biddle of Oxford University, found a mass grave containing the disarticulated remains of over 260 individuals, surrounding a central burial of very high status. The central skeleton, designated Grave 511, was a male in his mid-30s to mid-40s, taller than average for the period, buried with a sword, a small Thor's hammer amulet, and a boar's tusk placed between his legs. He had died from severe violence, wounds to the skull and a cut to the upper femur, suggesting he had been struck down in combat or executed with considerable force. Was this Ivar? There is no definitive proof. There is no name carved on the stone, There is no DNA database against which to check the bones. What there is a convergence of circumstantial evidence. The location at Repton, where the Great Heathen Army wintered in 873 to 874. The date of the bones, consistent with a death in the early 870s. The extraordinary status implied by the burial, with over 260 warriors arranged around the central grave as if in attendance. The saga's own statement that Ivar was buried in England. Scholars argue about it still. The argument itself is a testament to how much the question matters, to how large Ivar's shadow remains, even in the absence of his skeleton. What does it mean, finally, that the most consequential Viking commander of the 9th century could not walk? It means something that the age he lived in did not want to mean, and that our own age has still not entirely processed. Physical power in the culture Ivar came from was not merely useful, it was definitional. The warrior who could not fight was the warrior who did not count. The man who had to be carried was, in the Viking value system, a dependent, a burden, an object of pity at best and contempt at worst. The sagas tell us that when Ivar was born, his father Ragnar initially wanted him left to die, the standard response in that time and place to a child who appeared unlikely to survive, let alone to thrive. The exposure of disabled infants was not cruelty by the standards of the age. It was practical. It was merciful in the cold-blooded mathematics of a society that could not easily carry those who could not carry themselves. Ivar survived. And then he did something for which the value system that had wanted him dead had no category. He mastered it. He took the thing that his culture defined as weakness and built from it a kind of strength that his culture could not have anticipated, because his culture had never needed to imagine it. He could not win a one-on-one sword fight. He could win a campaign. He could not march at the head of his army. He could see the entire battlefield from above it. He could not project physical dominance in the moment. He could project strategic dominance across years and across the geography of two nations. The nickname Boneless was almost certainly given with some degree of contempt, or at least with the blunt descriptiveness of a culture that did not euphemize disability. But it survived because of what he did with it. Because the man defined by what he lacked built an empire with it. Because the thing that was supposed to limit him became in the end indistinguishable from the thing that made him extraordinary. There is a burial mound somewhere in the Midlands of England. It may contain his bones, or it may not. But the real monument to Ivar the Boneless is not in Derbyshire. It is in the language. It is in the street names of York, in the legal traditions that survived in the Danelaw for generations, in the genetic heritage of northern and eastern England, in the dynasty that ruled Dublin when Dublin was the most important city in the Viking world. It is in the fact that 200 years after his death, William the Conqueror felt it necessary, or the tradition felt it meaningful enough to record, that the old Viking's body had to be burned before England could be conquered again. You cannot conquer what Ivar conquered by being the strongest man in the room. You can only conquer it by being the one who has thought more carefully, waited more patiently, and seen more clearly than everyone else in the room combined. Centuries later, visitors walk the streets of York on a Tuesday afternoon, eating ice cream, photographing the medieval walls, queuing to enter the Jorvik Viking Centre, where archaeological replicas and reconstructed soundscapes bring the 9th century to approximate life. Beneath their feet, in the layers of compressed organic material that the waterlogged soil of the Ouse floodplain has preserved for 1100 years, the physical traces of the Viking city are still there. The leather shoes, the antler combs, the wooden bowls and loom weights and fish bones of a civilization that crossed the North Sea and decided to stay. And in Repton, in a Derbyshire churchyard, in a grave that may or may not hold the man who remade 2 islands, the question remains open. Academics publish papers. Isotope analyses are conducted. Ground-penetrating radar scans the soil for anomalies. The argument continues because the man who caused it was too significant to stop arguing about. He was carried ashore on a shield. He left on the shoulders of history. That is all the monument that Ivar the Boneless ever needed.